Hello, everybody. Welcome to yet another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. This is a show I really have been looking forward to for so long. I cannot stress how interested I am in my opportunity to meet up again and discuss the latest work of Diane Hennacy Powell, Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell. Diane is, I think, in my humble opinion, one of the most important researchers into cognition and an understanding of how the human brain functions and telepathy there is on the planet. And I say that quite precisely because her work is of profound importance. And Diane is one of these researchers that doesn't just take the anecdotes. She wants to do the research to understand whether these things are true or not. And her work is leading edge, beyond leading edge. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Diane. If anybody's interested as well, Diane was a guest on this show around about 6 or 7 years ago. And you can check up what she was up to then, but we're going to be going into far newer areas than that this time. But I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Diane. As you know, I'll be reading this because as a normal man, I can't read and chew at the same time or talk. So anyway, Diane Hennacy Powell, MD, is an author, researcher, public speaker, and practicing psychiatrist who started as a neuroscientist before obtaining her medical degree and training in medicine, neurology, and psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University. She became a member of the Harvard Medical School's faculty and later an original member of the La Jolla Group for Understanding the Origins of Humans, a think tank at the Salk Institute, with several world-renowned neuroscientists and Nobel laureates. She has spoken at international conferences such as Towards the Science of Consciousness and the IONS annual conference. Her research findings and hypotheses about the brain and psi are published in her book, The ESP Enigma, A Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena. Her current research focuses on autistic savants. Their abilities are so similar to psychic phenomena that they defy the current paradigm about the brain and consciousness. But unlike psychic abilities, theirs are accepted because they are reproducible. Her current project investigates savants who also report psi. She's currently collaborating with her brother, theoretical physicist and artificial intelligence expert Ken Hennacy, PhD, on creating a model for understanding consciousness and the quantum world. Diane, welcome to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
Oh, right. No, I adore your work. Absolutely. And if anybody gets the opportunity, we'll place an interview up that you did a couple of years ago, which is well worth watching. But one of the things that you discuss in that interview, I think is of profound importance because it was something we were discussing yesterday with Dr. Steve Taylor. And it's the problem of modern science and scientism not accepting and people's reputations being destroyed by an interest in this phenomenon. And I'll just give a little aside here. A few years ago, I was at a conference at the Scientific and Medical Network in London. And one of the people I got chatting to was Professor Brian Josephson. Now, Brian Josephson is one of a few, I think, if any, living Nobel Prize winners in the UK. And he's famous for the invention of something called the Josephson junctions, which is a quantum effect. Okay. Now, Brian is world famous. But the issue is Brian is also interested, as was Wolfgang Pauli and people like Erwin Schrödinger, in human consciousness and the reaction of human consciousness to reality. And he's been interested in telepathy. Now, a few years ago, there was a series of stamps that came out, which were stamps showing Nobel laureates. They refused to have Brian Josephson and a stamp on him, purely and simply because he was interested in telepathy. Now, this is outrageous. This is absolutely unbelievable. And Diane, you had a similar problem, didn't you, yourself, with your work?
Yes, I did. And it was really a shock to me. I mean, I knew that when I was in academia, one of the reasons why I left academia, in fact, was that I knew that I couldn't do the kind of research that I wanted to do while I was in academia. But I never thought that a medical board would take my license away on an emergency basis just because I had authored a book on ESP, but particularly a book that had been reviewed favorably by my alma mater medical school, Johns Hopkins, and that had even been reviewed favorably by 3 of the literary review agencies like Kirkus, such that it was in libraries all across the land, and including university libraries. And my book was even used for teaching in a undergraduate course by somebody who was captivated by the science of it. And so to have them just, without even looking at the book, just looking at the title of it and saying, oh, well, she obviously thinks ESP is possible, and we just can't let that be. We can't have somebody practicing out there who's interviewing people who might be psychotic and think that they're telepathic, and she's, confirming that that's a possibility. We just can't have that. And they took my license away. And what I did was, it's next to impossible to get your license taken back, getting your license back if they accuse you of being insane. Because the psychiatrist that did this to me said that I'm so intelligent, and because I am a psychiatrist, I know what to say, therefore I can't be believed. So,
gosh, it's like the Inquisition, isn't it?
Oh, it was.
That's yes, Jesuit logic, right?
Yes, yes. And this was just, this was in 2010. So paperback of my book came out in late 2008, and the hard copy came out in late 2008, the paperback in 2009. And so I was still doing my book tour and gaining momentum with my book. And then now, all of a sudden, if you Googled my name, the first thing that would come up was that on the internet would be that my license had been taken away on an emergency basis. And so I just kind of dropped out of sight. And a lot of people, I think, wondered whatever happened to me. And what happened to me was that I found somebody that would do neuropsych testing on me, and I underwent extensive testing and neurological testing, and petitioned to get my license back, and I got it back within 3 months. But the whole thing cost me a lot in terms of blood, sweat, and tears. And what I did was, once I dusted myself off, I said, okay, I'm going to do two things. One of them is I'm going to find irrefutable proof of these things. And number two, I'm going to use my background as a scientist to try to figure out how these things are possible. That's what I've been working on for the past 10 years.
And how has that gone then? How did that sort out in the end?
Well, in terms of, so things are actually going really well. I recently had an interview with the Center for a Conscious Planet at Harvard, and they're interested in collaborating with me. And I've had various people who are Stanford, Harvard, various other academic institutions who've contacted me and have told me that they really respect my work. And it's kind of below the radar, but the reality is that there are people out there in academia that have bothered to look at my work and who feel that I'm on the right path, and they want to see me to continue to pursue it. So we've come a long way in 10 years, and I think some of that is because of the work that I've been doing, even though I haven't gone and written another book. I've written a couple chapters in academic books. I wrote a chapter I was invited to write a chapter for the newest edition of the Oxford University Handbook on Psychology and Spirituality by Lisa Miller, who's the editor of that. And then I also was invited to become one of the founding members of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. And we now have 2 books that have been published, 2 volumes, and I wrote a chapter that's in the first volume. And that chapter discusses some of the work that's in a video lecture that I recently sent to you.
Oh, right. That's wonderful, because it's nice to know that there's such an organization and group of academics that are working together on this, because I think this idea of moving away from the materialist reductionist model is of profound importance. And a previous guest on this show, Professor Imran Baruch, who wrote a book with Julia Mossbridge called Transcendental Mind, I think it was called. In fact, it was this book here, Transcendent Mind with Julia Mossbridge. And I was quite surprised at this because I discovered that it was actually published by the American Psychological Association. So clearly the barriers are coming down, and we know that there are other researchers out there and people who are writing on the quantum physics side. I'm particularly reminded of people like, I can't think of his name now. He's a Serbian British quantum physicist who's been writing about the idea of consciousness and the idea of information theory as well. And of course, in your lecture, you talk about the work of people like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hamerhoff as well, which we'll probably get into later on. But for the moment, I'm really interested to wind back the years, as Simply Red said, and move back to the start of your work and the start of how you got into your interest in the whole area of seeming telepathic powers in autistic children. So could you tell us a little bit about that and go right back and tell us how it all started?
Well, if we go back to the very beginning, that would be when I was about 13, and I met someone through a friend of mine who was an assistant to a magician in the circus in the summer. And the magician was in town one summer, and Mark said to me, "You've got to meet this guy." And he just blew me away. And what he did was he told me to go over to this bookshelf, which, I mean, the bookshelf had, it's like your bookshelves in the back there. So all of these different books, he said, pick any book, turn it to any page, and I'll tell you what it says. And I picked up the book and I opened it up, and he just read it word for word. And then he said, "Oh, pick another book." And I picked another book from a different section of the bookshelf, and he did the same thing. And I said, "Well, how'd you do that?" And he said, "Well, it's just magic." I said, "Magic?" I said, "Well," he said, "A magician never gives you their tricks." And so that was something that puzzled me. And I asked my father, who was a scientist at the time. He was the head of the artificial heart program at Battelle Memorial Institute. And I asked him about it. He said, "Well, that sounds like that could be telepathy, but that's a really controversial area, but it could be that." And so my father, I had so much respect for him, and the fact that he didn't just automatically he's the one who actually was the first to use that word telepathy to me, that I really just had that in the back of my mind is something that is a possibility. And then when I went to medical school and trained in psychiatry, we were told in our training that if someone says that they can read people's minds, or if somebody says that they think that their thoughts are being read by someone else, that their thoughts are being broadcast, or that they can predict the future, or if they, just a whole list of different things, that if somebody says this to you, then it's a sign of psychosis and probably schizophrenia. And these are the drugs you use for that. And that, and I didn't have a cognitive disconnect at that point, because as you recall, the magician said to me, "Well, it's just magic." And so I just was like, okay, I don't understand how this works, but, and then when I was at Harvard and I was consulting on a patient on one of the medical floors who'd been admitted for a possible myocardial infarction the evening before. And I was asked to see her, and she wanted to against medical advice because she was seeing ghosts and that was spooking her out. And she just wanted to leave. And you can't leave if the staff think that you're insane. You're not considered competent to sign yourself out of a hospital. So that's one of those scenarios in which they would ask someone like me to come by and take a look. And I went in to see her, and sure enough, she said to me she was seeing all these ghosts there, and that's why she wanted to leave. And then she said, "And I'm also psychic, and I know my tests are going to come back normal." And I said, "Oh, I said, "Oh, you're psychic?" I said, "What made you psychic?" And she said, "Oh, I was born with the caul over my face,"
right.
And which is oxygen deprivation. And she also
I'd never realized that. Of course it is. Yes. Sorry.
And then she also happened to be half African American and half Native American. And I said to her, oh, well, that's very interesting. And I had this interest in knowing the beliefs of people who believed in things like voodoo, and those kinds of things, because at Johns Hopkins, where it's located right in the middle of an urban, ghetto, and you have a lot of people there who still retained their culture from Africa. And they would talk about things like roots, and they had various various ideas about things that they would let you do or not do, and so you have to understand their belief system, because when you're a psychiatrist, if someone's telling you something and it's really just their belief system from the culture they come from, then you don't label them psychotic. You just say, oh, well, they're from Haiti and people in Haiti believe in voodoo or blah, blah, blah. And so I've always had a little more of an open-mindedness, not only because of the fact that if you want to make innovations in science, you have to be willing to be there at the fringes of controversy. But at the same time, I also was aware of cultural differences in beliefs, and I'm fascinated by why people believe what they believe. And so I'm more willing than a lot, and I'm also believe in not retaining somebody in a hospital against their will, unless I'd rather talk somebody into staying and talk logic into them, and so help join them in their world, join them in their belief system, to try to see how I can work within that to meet them somewhere where we can have an agreement. And so I sat down with her. I said, well, I'd really just like to talk to you some more. And then she looked at me and she goes, you have this white light around you that's very similar to Jesus. And I'm like, oh, I'm just going to tell me I've got a halo or something, I thought it's kind of funny. And she goes, and I'm getting a reading on you. She says, so let me tell you what I'm seeing here. And she says, first of all, your husband's a chemist. And my husband was a biochemist. And then she says, and he's applying for a job in 2 different cities right now. And he actually was. That very week, he was applying for a job at UCSD in San Diego and a job back at Johns Hopkins. And she had my interest now. And she said, in his heart of hearts, he wants to go to one of those cities, but you'll end up at the other one. And I knew that my husband's desire was to go back to Hopkins. I mean, he was actually born at Johns Hopkins Hospital. His, great uncle was, one of the first anesthesiologists there, and so, long, 13th generation Baltimorean. So, I mean, he had a long history, a lot of family there. And to him, anything west of the Appalachians was not really worth bothering with. I mean, just, it was, a very stolid East Coaster. And so I knew where he wanted to go, but because of this one particular person who was doing research in California, he was willing to go there because he was wanting to do his postdoc with this man there. And so it was one of those things where I said to her, I said, well, which city are we going to end up in? She goes, well, name 10 cities and I'll tell you which one. And I named off 10 different cities. She goes, San Diego, you end up in San Diego. And then she started telling me all of these other things. And she was telling me things that were about my past, my present, and my future. And as time rolled on, the things that she said about my future all came true. So she really changed. She just rocked my world. She just made me say, okay, if I want to understand consciousness, I need to understand this. And that's really been a lot of my approach through the years, has been to just gather up all of these different puzzle pieces where people will say, oh, that's a mystery, and then they just ignore it. And also operating out of the understanding about nature, that nature is very, very frugal. And so these things that we think of as being just scaffolding or vestigial organs or whatever, that we say, oh, well, they don't have any usefulness, blah, blah, blah. And then you just toss them into the trash bin, as though, we don't need to pay attention to that. I always kind of questioned that as well. And so it's been an amazing journey, just kind of pursuing this from as many different directions as possible.
Do you know, when you were describing the image of you as a young girl and the magician coming to town and everything else, I had so many visions in my mind of Ray Bradbury stories. I don't know why, it just had that kind of wonderful carnival, carny kind of feel. And it's intriguing, isn't it, how he was able to do that? Because Sarah and I was going to be bringing this up later, but it segues in quite nicely with what you were talking about there. There is somebody that we've had on our shows earlier, Becky Sharrock, who suffers is the wrong term, but has superior autobiographical memory. Or higher superior autobiographical memory. She's quite world famous in that she's been on television and everything, and she's one of around about 8 or 10 people that have this autobiographical memory. And Sarah and I, on this show live about 6 months ago, tested her out, and she's a big fan of Harry Potter. And because Sarah has a young daughter, and Sarah has the Harry Potter books, so we tested her live and said, okay then, Sarah's going to take at random one of the books. She's going to read out the first lines and you finish it. And Sarah, she did, didn't she?
Yeah, she was amazing. And it did, there were various things that she did in the way that she experienced her world that were extremely unusual. And one of the questions I wanted to ask her most was about her dreaming, because she always remembers everything. She remembers all of her dreams, so all of her dreams are lucid. And she was explaining the way she sort of compartmentalizes information in her brains and how she color codes things. And it seems to be like she has a synesthetic experience of reality. Her perception is different. It's not just the fact that she's got this incredible memory. Her entire perception of the world and time is different as well.
Yeah, because that was intriguing. And it was just when you mentioned that person did the same kind of thing, clearly there must be some kind of trick going on here as well. But let's move on very quickly. So I just wanted to drop that in, and I'm hoping that Becky's watching this. I know she said she was probably going to try and listen in, but she's down in Australia, so maybe the timings may or may not work. But going back then, so you had all this, by the way, as well, it's all very sad. When we last chatted, my assistant then was Dia Nunez, who was African American, because she tragically died last summer, very, very suddenly. And the things you were talking about there would have been resonating very, very strongly with her from her Puerto Rican background. And she was some priestess of a group as well. So she would have been quite fascinated by this. But then you moved on then. So you then, what then happened that moved you on into the areas you're now involved in?
Well, let's see, moving on from when? we
moving
touched a
on
couple of different
from the wonderful experience with the lady who told your future. That pointed you in a definite direction, I would guess.
Well, what it did was it made me then interested in whether or not there was any literature that studied psychic phenomena, and so I discovered some of the literature that does, and I started going to some of the conferences that were available predominantly here in the United States, where you had people talking about these phenomena that were really taboo within the halls of academia. And so one of the first people that I met when I was doing that was PMH Atwater.
Oh, Phyllis! Wow.
Mm-hmm. And she's just a remarkable woman. And
I did an event with her in Australia a few years ago, and she's such a wonderful lady. She sent me her new book only about 3 or 4 weeks ago to read through.
I would love to. She has all of these individuals that she has studied who have had near-death experiences, and then there's the aftermath of those near-death experiences. And I would love, she and I talked about collaborating when I gave the keynote speech for the Monroe Institute this year. And it's just, and she was also there. But once again, we didn't get to meet in person because of the coronavirus pandemic. And it would have really been lovely to meet her in person. But we both agreed that we really should collaborate, because she said, and this was, hadn't heard my talk, but that she said, I really need to find a neuroscientist that really wants to investigate these things. Everybody's like, well, you should talk to Diane Powell. And so anyway, so I met her, and when she was giving her talk, I had my own epiphany, because she was describing these changes in people who'd had a near-death experience. And what was really an epiphany for me was that I actually recognized a lot of those changes in myself.
Interesting.
And so I had a conversation with her afterwards, and asked her, I said, all the changes that you describe are changes that occurred in me after I had a severe accident. And so going back in time, when I was 21 and applying to medical school, as I was crossing the street to literally mail my medical school applications, I was hit by somebody who was going, it was a rainy day, and they were going the wrong way on a one-way street. And I was hit by somebody and ended up on a neurosurgical floor. And I was unconscious for several hours. And when I came to, I had a splitting headache. And I was in this hospital, and I was, just kind of, disoriented briefly. And then what happened is that I thought about, well, what happened? How did I get here? And I was thinking about, and I feel different. Something's different about me. And I said, if I were to say what this is, it's a belief in a higher order of things, a belief in something divine, a belief in a God. And then I remembered the night before I had gotten into this philosophical debate with this woman who was in I was taking an advanced math course just for fun. And this woman was, and this woman was going to graduate school in math. And she said to me, where are you going to graduate school? Or where are you applying? I said, oh, I'm not applying to graduate school. I'm applying to medical school. And she was like, what? You're applying to medical school? She's like, how could you throw God's gift away? And like that. And I said, what? You believe in God? I said, how'd you get this far in mathematics and you believe in God? And she goes, how did you get this far in mathematics and you don't? And so we had this interesting conversation. And then I, somewhere in there, I just sort of said, well, I wish I believed in God, but I was raised by a father who was an atheist and had 3 graduate degrees in science. And so I was really raised with evolution and that paradigm. And I said, I can't believe in God just because, be nice. And then the next morning I'm in an accident and I wake up and I feel something very different. So I told PMH about that, and she said, head injury can cause the same thing, exactly the same thing. And so that's when I started putting two and two together, because I started thinking about acquired savant syndrome. I had known about savant syndrome for, I've known about savant syndrome for probably 30 years. It's one of the things that attracted me to neuropsychiatry and attracted me to autism. But it was so rare, and autism was so rare back then, that it was just one of those things that I just, that's one of those quirky things, these kids that can, spit out prime numbers in 6 digits and that sort of thing. But I started thinking about how acquired savant syndrome is so similar to, these people that have these psychic experiences, as a result of some, either, like I said, this woman who had the caul over her face and had oxygen deprivation at birth during a near-death experience. A lot of these people, their brains have reduced to oxygen for a period of time. And so trying to think about, what are common mechanisms that can somehow sort of pierce the veil so that we can access information that is outside of what we think of as the normal sensory capacity.
That was really fascinating, because yesterday's guest, Steve Taylor, we were talking about exactly the same thing. And his latest book is about trauma, and how people who have trauma of different ways, that they somehow start to, it's as if they've had a near-death experience. It's as if their worldview has been changed totally by the trauma itself. And he gave an example of somebody who was an alcoholic, and the way in which, you know, they couldn't get any lower. There was nowhere else they could go. And at that stage, I was thinking, you know, in many ways, this is quasi-shamanic. You know, it's the idea of the rendering of the body or the soul in order to open up the doors of perception, as it were. And now you're saying exactly the same thing, you know, and sometimes Sarah and I, my other associates, we always say, we're all being led here somewhere. We're all being joined together for some reason, because the information we are being giving, and the information you're giving now, believe me, is extraordinary. And I know there'll be people who are friends of mine that'll be listening to this at the moment going, oh my God, this is exactly the right time and the right place for this. So Diane, that was absolutely extraordinary. And I was sitting there going, woof, woof, you know, 2 talks, one after the other. And of course, another previous guest on this show, who you may know, is Dr. Penny Satori. And Penny did a lot of research again, and her latest book is The Transformative Effects of Near-Death Experiences. And she's written extensively about this. But literally with PMH Atwater, I mean, she messaged me only a couple of days, 2 or 3 days ago. And she was the person that set me on my own writing career. Because when I sent her the manuscript of my first book way back in the early 2000s, she came back to me and she said, right, you've written a book for yourself. Now go and write it for your readers. And it was one of the most profound things. And I think it changed my approach completely. And indeed, in my new book, I'm going to have a whole section on PMH and her own future memories that she had when she had her own near-death experience. And as you know, she saw her whole future laid out, and the future became as it was laid out to her. So very, very intriguing. So moving on then, so savant syndrome was something you thought this is a very interesting area to move into. Did serendipity then fall in your lap and you were given the opportunity to do this, or did you bring it about yourself?
I brought it about myself, actually. So one of the things that I did in my book, The ESP Enigma, is that I really discussed a lot of these different puzzle pieces that I alluded to earlier. And some of the puzzle pieces are, you know, a lot of these neuropsychiatric conditions that, you know, that I'm aware of and that I try to make sense of. But the other thing is that, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because of this, my gardener's here and I hear this from the lawnmower. So the other thing is that I wondered, you know, which of the different, each one of the brain conditions that I treat has different, you know, areas of the brain that are associated with it. And there's different brain activation patterns that you'll find in each, you know, like bipolar disorder is different from depression, is different from schizophrenia. And so each one of these conditions is something that I see as different. And I wondered which of these conditions report the highest incidence of psychic abilities, and then what do they share in common? And of course, the state that we all experience, or most of us experience, that can be psychic in somebody who's otherwise not psychic, is the dreaming state. And if you look at the dreaming state, what you see is that the usual activation pattern of the left hemisphere of the brain being dominant over the right hemisphere, and in fact, inhibiting the right hemisphere. That's our normal waking pattern. But when we are in dreaming sleep, it's reversed. The right hemisphere is active. And so I started looking at some of these conditions in which you have, it popped up that these conditions where you have that same pattern are the ones where you see the most psychic abilities. So people, for example, with bipolar disorder, they're very emotional, and we associate emotions with the right hemisphere, as we also associate intuition with the right hemisphere. And then if you think about who is it that has that kind of activation pattern in the waking state, It's actually people with autism. People with autism have a lot of left hemisphere deficits, and a lot of these savant skills are right hemisphere. Is, for example, that tremendous visual spatial processing that they can engage in. And so I made a hypothesis that this combination of there being a higher degree of savant syndrome in people who are autistic, and them having that brain wave pattern activation, that they would be the ones who are the most likely to exhibit ESP, if anybody could. And indeed, when I looked at Bernie Rimland, who was an expert on autism, a psychologist, when I looked at his research, I saw that he said that about 3% of his of the people that he studied had ESP. And so he said that he thought it was a savant skill. And so I said, I think I'm really on the right track, on the right track here. And so what I did was I just put it out there as a hypothesis, and people heard me, and they started contacting me saying, you're spot on. You're absolutely right. I have an autistic son, or I have an autistic daughter, or I have clinicians as well. I have an autistic patient, and absolutely they can read my mind. They can predict the future. I mean, different skills in different individuals. And the reason why I focused on children is because oftentimes these abilities go away, and the more we get civilized, the more that we buy into that, the more education we get, the more that we buy into the dominant culture, the more we start to dismiss these things as just coincidences and as impossible. Whereas children have this sort of innocence about them, and autistic children in particular, because oftentimes they're just getting homeschooled, and they're not in regular classrooms, and so they sort of stay suspended in that magical place that you often see really small children live in, where lots of things are possible, and they're convinced that there was a little fairy under the tree, or this or that, and so, but so many of us we get that sort of hammered out of us as that's just nonsense, and it goes underground. So I wanted to, if I was going to try to maximize, it's just sort of like if you're betting on a racehorse, you're going to check everything. And so to me, autism and in childhood was my hypothesis, and it's borne fruit.
Because that's very interesting, isn't it? Because in my latest book, I have a whole section on Charles Bonnet syndrome in terms of young children. And there's a guy whose name escapes me at the moment, who wrote a very interesting book, which he called InvisiKids, which was about these children and how they see somewhere through. And I think very much your argument about social conditioning and the way in which we are taught out of these things as we grow older is intriguing. And I also wonder whether it might be related possibly to the myelination of the neurons as somebody gets older, or it could be the corpus callosum becoming more effective. But effectively, I suppose if it was the corpus callosum was becoming more effective, it would mean that communication between the dominant and non-dominant hemispheres would be greater rather than less. Because one of the things you said in your lecture, which we'll continue the chronology now, but because we're discussing this at the moment, it was an area that I was quite interested in, was your point about Kim Peek and the things that Kim Peek was able to do into the classic Rain Man, and the way in which there seemed to be linkages there with his own neurology. Because I remember reading, and I think I put it in one of my books, and I probably stand corrected if I'm incorrect on this, but weren't there issues with his corpus callosum? Did he not have one or something? There was something quite strange about him, I think, in terms of that.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, actually, even though Kim Peek is the person that Rain Man was modeled after, and most people think he was autistic, he actually was not autistic. He had hydrocephalus.
Which is fascinating, this, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
I've never come across that before until I watched your lecture.
Yes. So he had hydrocephalus and was born without the connections between the left and the right hemisphere. So his brain is very disconnected in that sense. And yet he has this memory that is just absolutely astounding. I mean, over 12,000 books that he memorized word for word and could recite forwards and backwards, and encyclopedic knowledge about a lot of things. And so that kind of extraordinary memory, it doesn't make sense within the model within neuroscience that thinks that makes so much emphasis on the synaptic connections and whatnot. I want to just skip back to one thing that you said earlier, and that is that besides this left-right hemisphere activation pattern reversal, the other thing that happens during dreaming sleep is that the frontal lobes are less active. They shut down. And the frontal lobes are actually the section of the brain that we associate with, we associate the left hemisphere with logic, but we associate the frontal lobes, also with, this idea of, what is, what is possible, what are the consequences of things, just this ability to think from A to B to C to D to E, so that ability to follow a train of thought like that is associated with the frontal lobes, which is why young children, until those frontal lobes are myelinated, they're much more in that magical world as well. So it's that combination of those factors that it's, instead of during our waking state, adults, we're very left hemisphere frontal lobes focused, but in childhood and in dreaming sleep, it's a reversal pattern.
Because that, I know that Sarah, for instance, one of the things that Sarah is very interested in is lucid dreaming and how we become lucid in dreaming states. So clearly it seems that the brain is working almost as a unit. And it's one of the things that we are both very interested in. Again, in one of my latest books, I'm very interested in the role of glial cells and the way in which the calcium wave through the brain and the way in which there seems to be almost non-locality taking place in the brain, which presumably would solve something like the binding problem, the idea of how we have a feeling of simultaneity, whereas, in different parts of the brain, different things are doing things. And it makes you suddenly think, going back to the Kim Peek thing, it's really intriguing me now. So what we're saying is that because his corpus callosum was absent, he was effectively, as what I suppose Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga would argue, is that he was like a split brain patient, in the sense there were two identifiable areas of consciousness within. Because didn't you say that he was able to read two books at the same time using the visual system of either eye to read the two books simultaneously? This is fascinating stuff.
Yes, and yeah, I think that there's so much that we can learn from these people that are unusual like him. And I think you mentioned that you talked about John Lorber's work.
Yes, it'd be interesting to talk about Lorber as well, because I'm having difficulty in finding real source material on John Lorber. I'm going to have a section on John Lorber in my new book, but there's only I think one article I can find anywhere about it, and there's a lot of dispute about the students involved. But can you tell the listeners a little, the watchers, the listeners or whatever, a little bit about John Lorber's work as well?
Well, John Lorber was a British neurologist, and he, the one article you're talking about is, it was an article published in Science, so a very prestigious mainstream journal, titled "Is the Brain Necessary?" And that's because he saw this patient who had an IQ that was actually above average. I mean, it was 130 something, and yet he had hydrocephalus. He was missing most of his brain tissue. He had very little cortex because of having this buildup of pressure that occurs in the brain if there isn't proper drainage of the cerebrospinal fluid. And so it makes you wonder then, well, because that's an even more extreme case than Kim Peek of hydrocephalus. And then he went on to study hundreds of patients with hydrocephalus, and he found that of those who had very little brain tissue, that that half of them weren't mentally retarded. And the way that we tend to make so much of a put so much emphasis on the cortex, which is more evolved in humans than it is in most other mammals, and the way that we put so much emphasis on that as being the seat of our intelligence, and then to see these people who barely have any, let alone some of the substructures. So it made me start to really think about, well, okay, if people are, see, what you have to understand is that it's different if somebody is born with a condition than it is if they have a normally functioning brain that later has something done to it, like severing the corpus callosum.
Interesting. So when you do a split brain operation, it's a very different thing.
It's going to.
All right. Okay.
It's going to cause something different because the brain is not still undergoing development, and when it's still undergoing development, it can create all of these workarounds.
Because that's intriguing in itself, isn't it?
That was something I brought up with Steve yesterday. Like, now we're starting to discover that there are these neural connections in our heart and our gut, and we have an enteric nervous system, and the vagus nerve relays information throughout our body as well. And it seems that the human organism is much more of an integrated, holistic thinking being. So do you think that because I think the heart's the first organ to develop as a fetus, and that we kind of, I find it very interesting because ancient Egyptians believed that all of our thoughts and our spirit resided in our hearts, and they thought the brain was, their word for brain translates as something like skull offal. So they didn't necessarily, they recognized that if you touched certain parts of the brain, interesting things would happen, but they thought that our kind of personality and our spirit resided in the heart. So do you think there's on your talk, you were mentioning some of these more ancient systems of perceiving the way that the body and the mind and the spirit works, and that they're onto something that we've kind of lost knowledge of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What I ended up doing is I ended up looking more into Eastern, which, this is what a lot of physicists have done who've studied quantum mechanics. They've started looking into Eastern philosophies and the Vedanta sciences for answers. And so I think that what we have to realize is that our physical body is just the densest component of who we are, but that we actually have these subtle energy bodies. And so if you think of each of the subtle energy bodies, they connect to different aspects of who we are. So the etheric body, which is closest to the physical body, plays a role in maintaining the integrity of the body. As this one guru put it, he said, we have this memory that enables us to eat pork and not end up looking like a pig at the end of our life, because we're not turning into a pig by eating pig. Our body still turns it into us. And so each day when we wake up, each time when our body goes through that renewal, there's that memory. So that's the etheric body. And people who are who've studied these bodies say that that's where you first can detect something before disease actually occurs in the physical body. And so they're usually trying to heal that body. And then you have the astral body, which is more connected with emotions, which is also then, of course, we associate that more with the heart. And then you have the mental body, which we associate more with thought. And then you have the causal body. And, so you have these different, it's almost like the Matryoshka dolls, where you have different layered of these fields of information.
Yeah, it reminds me of Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields, and even Turing working on morphogenesis, this idea that there's this kind of blueprint of how an organism develops that's there before it's born, and is conceived as a kind of soul group type of thing, a pattern that I think Rupert Sheldrake was talking, I've seen a talk of his recently, where he talks about natural forces being kind of natural habits that over time create the material structures that we recognize.
I mean, and I was really impressed by the Carillion photographs that show you, like if you cut a leaf, that you still see the pattern of the whole leaf. So that energy exists there as information in a field. And I think that that's really the direction that this is all headed, is for us to understand more about that.
So would you say that you subscribe to like a electromagnetic field theory of consciousness or something like that?
Something like that, but we don't really truly understand electromagnetism. And so we have to be careful when we, because we can't explain something with something that we don't understand. And one of the things I've become interested in is if you look at electromagnetism and you look at how information can be encoded in a standing wave, and you look at how we are in resonance with the earth, and how that the Schumann frequency of 7.8 hertz seems to be really associated with that border between alpha and theta, which is also associated with sort of psychic abilities. So there's these. So it's almost like if we're in that frequency range, we can tap into information that's contained within that standing wave, and information can be contained through various means. I mean, the radio, FM radio does modulation of frequency in order to encode information, and AM radio does modulation of the amplitude. And there's in the electromagnetism, there's not just the electrical component and the magnetic component. Yeah. There's also a scalar component. And the scalar component is the component that is instantaneous. So that's been where people have, they poo-pooed the whole idea of electromagnetism playing a role here, is because electromagnetism is not instantaneous if we're just looking at the transverse wave qualities of it. But if you look at the scalar wave, it is immediate, and the scalar wave penetrates everything, including Faraday cages.
So this is of fascinating importance, isn't it, in terms of going down this route of scalar waves and everything else. And it was something, again, I was touching upon in an article I was writing recently. And it really shows that we need to be starting thinking differently when we're discussing the brain, because we seem to, we're not solving Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness by following the routes we are following. We need to look at people's experiences and look at things empirically from experience. But your work is profoundly important as well, because you don't just do the anecdotal, do you? And drawing the discussion back onto the chronological order of what you were doing, can we talk a little bit now about how your first student, I think his name was Ramses, I think, and the work you did with him, and then subsequently the fascinating work with the young Indian child, the young mathematical savant, because it's still, every time I read that, I hear you talk about that, it sends shivers up my spine, because it's so powerful.
Well, the first savant that I actually studied was a little boy named Vishal, who lives in India. So I went to India and spoke at did an all-day sort of symposium based on my book, the ESP Enigma. And I was invited by the Indian government to go do that. And I met this an Indian psychiatrist there who told me about this boy who, if he touches someone, he only touches people if they have a disease, and they have a disease where he touches them. And so one day this boy had touched this woman's breast, and the woman was kind of aghast at what happened. And then he says, "Oh, you better get a mammogram, because you might have something going on with your breast." And sure enough, she had breast cancer. So that was an interesting little anecdote. And I evaluated 3 different savants there. And all of them had different abilities. I mean, one of them was had some precognitive abilities, and also was just a master at puzzles. In fact, she put together I think it was 1,000-piece puzzle in which all of the pieces were the same color. And she did that in something like 3 days. And she was somebody that her parents couldn't, they couldn't hide from her. She was addicted to, potato chip type, you call them crisps, I think, in England.
Yes.
So if they didn't give her all of the crisps that were in the in the package, she'd tell them, no, there's still some more left. There's a couple.
Wow.
And then there was another child I evaluated who knew things in science without ever having studied science. And so I was asking him various questions. I was asking him, I was like, what is Huntington's disease? He said it was some kind of, problem with the brain, and things like that. And so I'm just like, how does this little 5-year-old, I mean, he hasn't been exposed to science, know that? And in the course of looking at these children there and talking with the parents, what I discovered is that they all said that they had some instances of telepathy with these children. And then I thought, oh gosh, if I know the answer to something and I'm asking it, how do I know that he's getting it because he's somehow picking up the science from, the Akashic records or whatever you want to call it, the ether, versus just tapping into my own knowledge of something. I said, well, I really, because telepathy is something that could be confounding all of this, I really need to test for telepathy. And I also realized that that's much easier to demonstrate, because proving that someone hasn't on the side, even though they're very young, studied math or studied, some of these things, or studied a language that, so if you have a parent that says, oh no, I've never been exposed to that. I mean, I have no way of proving that. But if you have two people that are isolated from one another and you're saying to one person, okay, I want you to, read this piece of paper and think about, try to transmit this message over to this person on the other side of this barrier. And then you have that person type it out, then that, to me, can be demonstrated in real time. And so I really started focusing more on the telepathy, because all you have to do really is prove one of these things and you blow the paradigm.
Oh, absolutely. Because this is the thing, it's your white crow, isn't it? Or your black swan, and it is. And, it just needs one thing to prove this. Can you tell us a little bit? The case that always intrigues me is the case of the young, I think she was Indian, wasn't she? The one that her mother was a mathematician and she initially thought she was a savant. And then you discovered quite the contrary, that she was psychic.
Oh yeah, she's actually not Indian,
right.
but she,
okay.
but her parents came over from another country, and so she's got dark hair and whatnot. But I've kept her identity, on the down low. But people saw videos of her mainly from the back. Mm-hmm. You see these cute little pigtails, and she's just, squealing with glee, as she got the answers right. And how she was discovered was that her parents had, the father was a psychiatrist who was aware of savant syndrome. And so they thought that she was a mathematical savant because she was able to solve these highly complex mathematical questions, but she couldn't do simple arithmetic. And so that's oftentimes what you see with these savant skills. That's what makes it a savant skill, is that they have this ability to do something that's very extraordinary, but they don't have the underlying basic abilities that you would think that were a precursor to that. And so one day when he had hired people to come into the home to do math work with her. And one day the person doing that work with her was doing the calculations on one device, and that device, the battery went dead or something. And so she pulled out an iPad to do the calculation. And it, for some reason, gave the answer in exponential notation. And instead of typing the answer like she normally was typing it, this girl, Haley, typed it in exponential notation. And then that's when this person said, hey, wait a minute. How'd you do that? She says, and so that she said, it's like you can read my mind. Well, if you can read my mind, then tell me, you know, what the name of my landlord is. And so she typed out helmet, you know, and that's not a real common name. And then that's how she was discovered. And so they started doing telepathy experiments.
And didn't she do that bit where she asked her to say type I love you in German? Was that?
Well, so what happened was that the first therapist who discovered this about her was the mother of a young child. So her hours started getting reduced. So they brought in another therapist to work with her because they wanted somebody to keep working with her, but they didn't tell her about the telepathy because they were still trying to reconcile that in their own way of thinking. And so they just brought her in to continue working with her on her homework. And what happened was that the second therapist noticed that Haley would make the same mistakes that she might make in spelling. And then she independently said, it's like you can read my mind, you know. And then she said, well, you know, can you say, you know, I love you in German? And then that's when she typed out ich liebe dich. Yeah. So, so I was able to go and do extensive testing with using both therapists. And it was just really remarkable. And so that was quite a while ago. That was back in about 6 years ago. And I have been in contact with the family, and they've been quite busy since then. They've adopted a couple of other children just so that she can have some socialization. So they've been very busy with that, but I've spoken with them by email, and they've told me that she's still telepathic. She's still able to do it. So I really want to go back and do a follow-up study.
Yeah, because it's quite intriguing, this, because I took the opportunity a few years ago. In fact, I think it was after I came across your work, and I had the opportunity to work as a consultant, a management consultant at a local school here called Young Epilepsy, which is about 8 to 10 miles away from where I live here in Surrey. And the school has children who have epilepsy, temporal lobe epilepsy, or they have autism and everything else. And they're in little houses, and they have people that look after them and take care of them. There's groups of about 10 or 11 of them in each house. And I had the opportunity to talk to the psychiatrists that work there. And, you know, the psychiatrist told me, he said, no, we see psychic ability happening all the time. And then I took the opportunity to talk to some of the managers of the houses. And they said, oh, it's intriguing. What these children know about everything is extraordinary. As you said, they couldn't hide things because the kids knew where they were. They also had this innate ability to know what time of day it was. So if they were late for lunch, even though there were no clocks, they knew. And it seems to be that, you know, as they said, it's other skills, isn't it? It's something that they really are tuning into something in some way. And this leads me in now really to moving on now to the work you're now doing. I mean, what's the how's your work progressing? What's the latest? Can you give us some really nice, interesting developments that you're involved in that we can talk about? That would be really great.
Sure. Well, so one of the things that I have heard several of these children say, and I want to find out if it's really universal, is that they don't feel like they're in their body. And so they have a tenuous mind-body connection.
Oh my word.
Which is really fascinating, because if you think about a lot of the work that was done at Stanford Research Institute, you know, the remote viewers describe doing it by doing astral projection, out of body, you know, having out of body experiences. And if you think about these children, the ones who are the most telepathic in my experience are all children who had their language disrupted when they were about 1.5 years old. And so they had their language disrupted, and they still have receptive language. In other words, they still understand language, but it's expressive language that's disrupted. So it's more like what we call a Broca's aphasia. So their ability to coordinate their body to type, or their ability to coordinate all of the muscles in the mouth, including the tongue, obviously, and the lips, all of that, to be able to coordinate all those to create speech, that's what's impaired in them. And they develop this impairment at the time when they're just starting to be able to communicate in a way that's different than what I think is probably an innate telepathic bond that exists between the mother and particularly the mother and the child, mainly because the child used to be within the womb of the mother. So, I mean, how much more connected can you get than actually, being inside someone else's whole, body and consciousness field right there in the center of it. And so what I suspect is that telepathy is part of the system that enables us to acquire language. But then once we acquire language, we become very, very left brain focused, and we become more, focused on the logic and focused on, on this reality. And there's this other reality that then gets, it just gets sort of pushed to the side, and we experience it mainly in the dream state. So if you're disrupting brain development, and they get frozen in that telepathic thing, and they're wanting to communicate and have others, communicate with them. They're wanting that connection. I mean, that's the perfect setup for telepathy. So this whole idea of how this brain rewiring, and at what age this brain rewiring occurs, and what's different about these children is something that I'm really interested in. And I'm interested not just in trying to get imaging about how their brains are functioning, but I'm actually very interested in measuring their energy fields themselves, because they say that they have this difficult relationship with their body. There's a book that came out several years ago that was written by a little Japanese boy who was autistic, and the name of it is The Reason I Jump, and there's a movie now about that. And the reason that he jumps is, he says that he's trying to catch up with his soul. It's like his soul's trying to leave his body. So to think about, if our consciousness, because if you think about consciousness, we can focus our consciousness in different places. If I focus my consciousness interiorly in my body, I start to become more aware of different sensations within my body. And some people become so hyper-focused on those inner sensations that they become kind of hypochondriacal. But if you can also focus your consciousness on something that you use as an instrument or a tool. So these people who, for example, play an instrument from a very early age, or play, basketball, where they, like globetrotters that could just do all these, fancy things with that ball. It's like they become one with that object. And if you actually look at their brain, you see that that object that they've mastered is actually mapped onto the homunculus in their brain. So that area of the brain where we map everything that's our body can actually have other things mapped into it that enable us to put our consciousness there in a way that makes us as seamless with that as we are with different parts of our own body. And then if you think about somebody who's a hypnotist, or somebody who's engaging in suggestology, what they're trying to do is they're trying to impose something onto somebody else's consciousness. So this idea of consciousness being something that we can center it in the middle of our body, we can put it out here. People can, that consciousness field, is not something that's, it's dynamic. It's not something that's static. And so the brain is really our navigational instrument for that consciousness field. And, what I believe is different parts of the brain, like the temporal lobe, temporal, it's very interesting. It's named temporal because that has to do with tempus, with time.
Yeah.
And so this idea of being, time dilation, a lot of people have brought up time dilation as a potential way of understanding some of these psychic abilities. And if you think about it, our perception of time varies depending upon our mood state, but it also our state of consciousness. When we're dreaming something, we could have something happen in a dream that's only a minute and a half long, that's played out like hours, during the dream. And similarly, you mentioned PMH Atwater's future memory and some of her experiences. And she talks about how she's had these experiences where time expands, where she can get all of this stuff done. Like one time when I think she had a kitchen disaster and, with some kind of, gooey, syrup or something. She was making homemade syrup or something that just kind of exploded all over the place. And she just went, and miraculously was able to do it in very little time. And so this whole idea of time is of interest to me. And one of the things that I found a study looking at autistic children, and their perception of time is different. In this study, what they found is just like we have a flicker fusion frequency. In other words, if you have a light bulb, and whether or not it looks like a constant signal or it looks like it's flickering, it depends upon that fusion flicker frequency. And there's a similar thing with sound. And so people with autism will hear two sounds that are more distant in time as collapsed and simultaneous.
Intriguing.
So these are the kinds of things that these are like, so I'm getting finer and finer points to my, my puzzle pieces where I'm trying to, stitch together this understanding.
I think you may find, I don't know if you've had the opportunity yet to read my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, but a lot of the areas that you're talking about here, I feature in the terms of time dilation, the way in which the temporal lobes seem to have an effect. I work quite closely with people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, people who experience the aura state of migraines. And again, it seems that, time can dilate in some way. And a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time, where I discussed about the experience of time. But one of the things that I really am interested in, and, this is almost going to be off-piste as it is, because it's something that I've had struggled to try and find, and you may be the person that may know about this, is that because it's something to do with my own psychology, I have a kind of peculiar memory as well. I have, I think in many ways, I sometimes think I'm a higher functioning autistic person myself, because I have quite a strange memory in terms of the things I can remember, in terms of facts and figures and everything else. I don't tend to forget things. And I was just wondering, I have read that there is a die-off of the neurons in the final month or two of the embryo, and that the brain reprograms itself and a lot of the neurons die off and they're replaced. Am I right in that? I've found it very difficult to find source material for this, but I have read it a couple of times in my past, but I can't recall where the articles were. Do you know about this?
You're saying that it occurs when they're in the embryonic stage?
Correct.
Because my understanding has always been that when we're born with, you know, all of these neurons and all of these potential neuronal connections, and that it's during the first, you know, say 4 years of life that there's this pruning process that occurs, which is basically causing it, and which is being done by the microglia.
Yes.
Okay, the microglia are the cells that are in the brain that are very similar to macrophages. So they're essentially function like immune cells. And the reason why they're in the brain is predominantly to sculpt the brain during development. And so there is a massive dying off of neurons that occurs then, you know, and a lot of it is under the microglia are more active under hormonal influence, and little boys have testosterone from the very, you know, the get-go, and then their testosterone level goes down during the you know, the time period when they're in grade school, and then in pubescence, then their testosterone comes up again. And in girls, we develop estrogen, you know, we have estrogen when we go through puberty. So that's the first time that we get washed in hormones. And then again, we get washed in hormones if, you know, if we get pregnant. And those are times, each one of those is a time when the brain is undergoing a tremendous amount of remodeling.
The reason I ask this is that in my own research, I mean, I was 5.5 weeks premature myself, and Caesared and everything else, because my mother had toxemia and they had to get me out, and they cut me out, and they broke my arm as they pulled me out, and everything. There's all the background stories of that. But my research has shown that there's an awful lot of people who are autistic who are premature in some way. And I just wondered whether there could be a link here in some way, because I know that Kim Peek was quite premature, as I recall. And I just wondered whether there could be a link made in some way to premature babies and autism, and particularly, you know, sort of other wired, the way the brains function is different in some way. I mean, I have eidetic imagery where, you know, I can read a page of a book, you know, and I think of something and things come automatically to me. I don't have to think about something. It's just there. And the amount of times in, you know, when I'm writing or something, it just appears in my mind. I'll either see the image or it will just be there. And it will only subsequently, I'll go back and read up and find I'm right. I mean, for instance, I've never been beaten on Trivial Pursuit, ever. Nobody has ever beaten me on Trivial Pursuit. And it's just because my brain works in it. There's not the kind of the logic. I don't have the kind of the logic A to B to C. It just leaps into the information and it just pulls it out. And it's something that you said in your interview, that people who have this kind of strange way of thinking. And I'd just be interested, maybe we can talk about this privately at some other stage, because I know that Sarah, and there'll be a lot of people who are in my group who are very interested in out-of-body experiences. And the stuff you're saying in terms of out-of-body experiences, I know they're going to be jumping up with absolute excitement here. So Sarah, would you like to come in here with a couple of questions? Because I know you really will be wanting to do that because of the OBE stuff.
Yeah, there's so many things that I want to talk about. I could just talk all day, because it's brilliant being able to talk to someone that's done so much scientific study of it and has so much firsthand experience of this kind of unusual behavior. But I just kind of, it brought to my mind the idea of play consciousness when you're little, and how you can play and how your time perception is different when you're a small child as well. Because you know, when you're at school, we used to have like half-hour lessons that seemed like they went on for about 2 hours when we were in them. And then I remember it's the only useful bit of information my dad ever gave me was you might have some more in like, you know, it's going to come out later on, but he said to me that when you get over 40, life starts to speed up, and I think he's really right. And when I was a kid, I remember playing, and I used to be able to overlay the kind of fantasy scene on reality. And I think I've read that when you go through puberty, you go through this neuronal pruning back, and you tend to lose some of your ability to kind of see everything in sharp focus. And sometimes when I do lucid dreaming workshops, I do this kind of memory practice where you walk around a space that you were really familiar with when you're about 8 years old, and you realize that you can remember the details of things that you couldn't remember in your 20s or older, because everything that comes in through your senses is kind of equally measured. You don't have the same sort of filters or the same focus or attention areas. And I just think that time perception really alters as you get older, and you're obviously going through this process of paying more attention to certain kinds of activities or certain habits, and you perhaps lose some of those imaginative powers and intuitive powers as you get older and conform to a routine.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of, a lot of theories about, why is it that we perceive time differently as we get older. I mean, and none of them have really made a whole lot of sense to me in terms of, I mean, so one theory is, that we lose dopamine, so we have less dopamine as we get older. But I don't think it's as simplistic as that. I really don't. I still don't know, what's going on as we get older. We're still trying to figure out, we're still learning about, the aging brain. And the thing is that here's one of the confounding factors is that I know that I have experienced time going much faster. I mean, I'm amazed, that I'm at this stage in my life. I'm just like, gosh, where did it all go? But the thing is that even my daughter, who's obviously significantly younger than me, she has always experienced time going faster. And so it could be that time is quickening for all of us, and we just attribute it to, oh, well, it's because I'm older now. But I really do think that something is happening, on a much larger scale. I mean, just look at how, quickly our technology is developing. I mean, just so many things. Look at the amount of information that we process on a daily basis now compared to the amount of information that we used to process. So I think that there's something happening in the consciousness, the collective consciousness, that maybe is really driving that whole thing. I'm not so convinced that we're going to be able to, identify, some particular deficit of something in the brain, to explain it. I haven't seen anything that's real convincing. One of the things that I'm become really fascinated by is this whole idea of it. And I think in your book, I looked a little bit at your book, Perceptions of Door's Perception, and you talk about these two different consciousnesses. You talk about the idonic consciousness and the demonic consciousness, which is kind of interesting, that this idea of these two different types of, well, they're two different informational fields, really. Mm. And it ties in with this book that I recently read that was sent to me by someone who heard my lecture. And he saw when I was talking about Daniel Quiche. Daniel Quiche, the person who is blind, who is able to, he's able to even mountain bike.
Oh yes. I wanted to talk to you about that.
And he uses echolocation in order to navigate his environment. And so Doug is somebody who actually has studied Daniel, and has a doctorate in optometry, and then went back and has a master's in rehabilitation of the blind. And we had the most amazing conversation because we talked about what's really going on. How is it that someone like Daniel can navigate? I mean, he's climbed, there's a picture that I have of him now where he's on top of a glacier. I mean, and so this ability to navigate is like, is key. I mean, that's why we have this, this is why we have this brain, is to help us with navigation. And he has this whole theory about navigational consciousness. And I guess to try to put it, my take on it is, it gets back to what I was saying earlier about where do we focus? Do we focus inside or do we focus out there? And if you're blind, you're not getting that sensory input, okay, that locks you into that sensory driven way of navigating. So he's accessing that other navigational possibility that really is more closely related to psychic abilities, as far as I'm concerned. And one of the reasons why I say that is because of a book that Doug wrote called The Esoteric Helen Keller. And Helen Keller was not only blind, but she was deaf. And she was able to navigate around. So she's not doing echolocation because she can't hear.
Yeah.
So just think about how could somebody like her, she'd run around like any other little girl. And when she played a joke on her, I think it was either her mother or her nanny. She played a joke where she locked her in the pantry and hid the key, when she was about 8 years old. And in reading this book, what was fascinating to me was that Helen Keller was introduced to Swedenborg. And she became, she became enamored with his work, and actually reports having at least one out-of-body experience. And I'm just trying to, I just read this book, and I'm playing with that idea of like what is an out-of-body experience like for someone who doesn't have vision or hearing.
Well, in some NDE reports have visual information. I don't know about specific ones, but I've heard
there's the Vicky Omepeg, wasn't there?
Do have
case.
I don't know whether that would have been. I don't think that was the case for Helen Keller, that she saw things. But Helen Keller is an amazing character. She
is, and she was, and the thing is that she said she sees.
What? So when she was in an out-of-body experience, she was seeing, yes?
That's my understanding, yeah. And she went to Paris.
Wow. Because could this be something to do, because you touch upon it, I mean, possibly, I think about, in one of my books, I discuss about the role of pineal sand, and the piezoelectric effect of the crystals inside the pineal gland. And I know you mentioned in your thing about is it in the nose where we have something that we can echolocate or whatever?
Yeah, well, we have magnetite.
Yes, magnetite, of course.
Yeah. We have magnetite in our nose, just like birds have it in their beak. And then we also have magnetite along our temples here. So the sphenoid bone sits at the base of the skull, and it's the only bone that connects with in the cranium that connects with all the cranial bones, and it is rich in magnetite. And the way that it comes up like this, okay, and then we have magnetite in our nose. It creates these 3 reference points for magnetic fields, which is very helpful for navigation. And of course, then we have the GPS in our system. We have place cells and grid cells that help us to locate where we are. So what I think is that in these people who suffer from blindness at a very young age, that they use this alternative navigational space that probably does use the pineal gland, that they're using this alternative navigational space, mechanism, just like I think that people who have their language disrupted at an early age, they maintain the telepathy as their alternative. So that's why I'm fascinated by that, this idea of, early insults to brain development while it's still actively developing, and then you get these special skills. Well, it makes sense if you've got these two different systems.
Because this is then interesting, isn't it? Because it could explain things like blind sight, and hypnotic
yes, absolutely.
blind sight.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wasn't there someone in your talk that you were mentioning that could see magnetic fields?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how did they experience that?
Well, so if you look at rocks, okay, you know, that are, you know, some of them there are different electromagnetic properties of different minerals. Okay, so some of them have the kind of crystal lattice structure that causes this you know, influence on, you know, electromagnetic fields, let's say. Okay, and so we know what that looks like. And then there are some that they don't have any, you know, electromagnetic properties at all. And so this person was able to distinguish, they were correct on the way they described the electromagnetism around a rock was correct for what we know about that particular type of mineral, for example. You know, like quartz crystal, you know, versus, you know, like, you know, something else. I mean, my mind's blanking on that right now, but the point, you get the point, is that that's what she was doing. And then additionally, she could, if you had a bar magnet, you know, and not a bar magnet that's painted with the South Pole one color and the North Pole another color, but just a bar magnet without any markings on it, she could always tell you which was the North Pole and which was the South Pole, because she saw a different color coming out of them.
And she could do that 100% of the time.
100% of the time. Because it was just like the people who have synesthesia.
Yeah.
Where it's not something like they're turning it on and off. It's just there all the time. So it's seeing energy fields is, I mean, some people think that it's a form of synesthesia, but that's to me is just, you know, there's no need to get into labeling it or trying to, you know, describe it as that, but it's just that some people just see it. Just like some people will always see the color blue when they hear the, you know, a C, you know, and maybe green when they, you know, when they hear, you know, E, you know. So it's hubris for us to just dismiss some of these things as possible just because we ourselves don't experience it.
Well, I call it electromagnetic chauvinism. You know, the idea that we believe that what we're seeing from the electromagnetic spectrum is exactly what is out there. Well, of course, you know, the interpretation of the color blue or green or whatever is totally dependent, and it's a subjective experience. It's just vibrations, you know, it's just a vibrational state. And I sometimes feel that we get a little bit carried away with saying there's a one-to-one relationship, you know, the naive realists who think there's a one-to-one relationship between what I'm perceiving and what is out there, when it's far more complex than that. It's far more intriguing. You know, and, you know, we know that certain people, their attunement is wider in some way. And it must be very frustrating when you're perceiving these things and you can't convince people that you're seeing them. And that's why somebody like you is a godsend for these people, because it's somebody who is coming along and saying, I believe you. I believe what's happening. Let's now do the science to understand exactly what's taking place here. I find it amazing that your work isn't out there with the world beating its way to your door, because what you're doing is so extraordinary. It astounds me that you're not world famous. It really does. You know, is this again this kind of cult of scientism and people are fearful of this work you're doing?
Well, I think some of it is because, as I said earlier, I kind of went underground. I stopped being so vocal because of what the board did to me. And I'm just now really, I've been doing a lot of the kind of research that I can do without it costing me a lot of money. But what I'm doing now is I'm forming a team of scientists and other, you know, other skill sets, so that I can be doing not only more research, but then more, you know, educational work, teaching people what I do know. So I'm looking at various different possibilities, and somebody who's going to try to help me find funding, and so I'm pulling together people with different skill sets, and I think the world's more ready for it now, and I know that I'm more ready for the world from the standpoint that I don't think they could throw anything at me that I couldn't handle.
Well, I'm hoping that what's going to happen here is, because Sir and I, we move in quite interesting circles, and a lot of our associates and friends, particularly some of the younger researchers, are bit heavily involved in research into entheogens, dimethyltryptamine, ayahuasca, and the neurochemistry of altered states of consciousness. And I know that a lot of them will be watching this, or will be catching it either now, but probably will catch it when it's recorded. And I'm hoping that what's going to happen is, they're going to be bouncing up and down, because what we need to do is join dots here, and the more people we involve in this, the more we're going to see the patterns, as it were. It's like a huge Venn diagram, and inside that Venn diagram, there will be this sudden realization. We'll probably all stand around and go, how can we not see that? In one way or another. But I think your work is so important in many ways. I would like to really take the opportunity now to go on a little bit more about the experiments you've been doing with the children, the autistic children, in terms of their telepathic abilities. Have you got any stories or anecdotes of the things that you saw and you thought, this is just extraordinary? Just as as a kind of towards the end of the interview or discussion that you could tell us about, that will make, that will be of interest?
Oh, I've seen so many things that are extraordinary.
Come on, share them, Diane, share them, please.
Well, so the research that I did with Haley that I had talked about earlier, Daryl Treffert saw some of that. I mean, so he Can
I just stop there? Just by the way, guys, Daryl Treffert was an earlier guest on this show. If you want to check that one out as well, you might find that of interest. Okay.
And so I've had people witness my experiments. It hasn't just been me doing. So he witnessed my experiment with Haley, and then another child that I've worked with, who is from his parents are from India, named Akil. Extraordinary, just like Haley, only he's able to. His mother's worked with him a lot, and he was older at the time that I tested him, so he's able to type independently. And so, similar to Haley, I can give the mother a complete sentence that's just totally made up, or random numbers or whatever, and he's got astounding 97-98% accuracy, and so highly telepathic. And so I told Deepak Chopra about it, and he came and witnessed one of my experiments. Actually, what I did was I said, you come with the envelopes. Each envelope will have something in it that you've had randomly generated, and nobody's seen this, not even Deepak, nobody's seen this, and we'll hand it to the mother and have her look at it, and we'll have him do his thing. And 100% accurate. And Deepak Chopra was so blown away that when it was time for him to leave, he left just so kind of mind boggled that he left behind his jacket, his wallet, his backpack. So we had to send a car to deliver those to him in New York.
Wow.
We were in New Jersey. So it's really, as far as I'm concerned, I've presented this research at different scientific conferences. I've had a lot of people comment upon it, and I feel that it's time to really take it to the next level. So what I want to do now is I want to use the technology that can really measure biometrics, so that I can understand, so that I can have something that's an objective measure to show what's going on here. So, for example, there's this technology that can assess the chakras. and that can access it can measure the chakras and their strength, and then also whether or not they are deviated, you know, to the left or the right of the central, you know, spinal column. Okay.
How does that do? How does the technology do that then? What's it doing?
So it's measuring. So if you think about, you know, when we do an EEG. Okay, so when we do an EEG in a quantified EEG, what we're doing is we're taking a measurement of, you know, let's say 32 different points on the skull, okay, and measuring the electromagnetic signal at the skull, okay, gives us this pattern that with our sophisticated computers, we can actually break down all of those signals and tell you which different sections of the brain are what frequencies and the amount of bandwidth, you know, and how it compares to normative data, and they can say where it's coming from in the brain. So it's like a three-dimensional EEG, if you will. But then, in addition to that, there is this technology where you can take each one of the fingers of your hands and you put it into a device that applies a pulsed electromagnetic field, and you get this discharge of photons and electrons, and it's measuring that, which gives you a sense of the strength of your energy field. So your energy field and your chakras. And you need to measure, you know, all of the different fingers, and then you have the holographic field. And that kind of technology has existed in Russia for, gosh, I first became aware of it about 15 years ago.
Really?
And I'm very interested in using that to see if I see a consistent pattern here. Because I really think that you know, it's got so many wonderful things about it. It's non-invasive, and it really would give us more information than something like an fMRI, you know, which is really primarily measuring blood flow, which we've discovered it's not as accurate as we had thought in terms of, you know, the brain activity. That the quantified EEG, I think, is superior.
There's somebody I very much need to put you into contact with, is Professor Istvan Bokken, who is an associate of mine who was doing some fascinating research in Budapest, and I think he's now based in New York, and he occasionally sends me his papers. We need to talk about that at some other time, because I think a lot of the work you're doing here very much has a great deal of synergy with what he's doing, which could be very, very good. One of the things that, again, in your lecture, I found really interesting was frontotemporal dementia, in terms of how that is. The reason being that a previous guest on this show is a lady called Maggie Latourelle, who wrote a book which I strongly advise you check out, called The Gift of Alzheimer's, where she records her mother's deterioration into Alzheimer's and everything else. And when she started then to show amazing telepathic skills, extraordinary telepathic skills. And I was just interested in frontotemporal dementia. So this is not, it's not Alzheimer's as such, is it? It's something that is qualitatively different. It's not the amyloid plaques. It's nothing to do with amyloid plaques, I guess, and things like that.
No, no, it's there are different types of dementias, and that's when I was when I trained as a neuropsychiatrist. I mean, what I would do is I would do exams on people, asking them certain things, and I would, based on what they could and couldn't do in the pattern of their cognitive deficits, then diagnose it as either a cortical dementia or a subcortical dementia. So there's a dementia that's associated with Parkinson's, there's a dementia associated with Huntington's. Those are both subcortical dementias, but then Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia are both cortical dementias, but they affect the cortices differently. So, in both Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia, you can have a loss of function in the temporal lobe. I mean, and in the frontal lobes. But it's really more just the pattern. There's something about with frontotemporal dementia, they're predominantly losing frontal lobe activity and temporal activity, whereas so you just have this. As I mentioned earlier, the frontal lobes are not as well myelinated in children as they are in adults. And so what you're doing is you're removing, it's almost like giving them a frontal lobotomy. If you think about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they become much more less inhibited. And I think that they become less constrained. If you think of the frontal, our usual brain activity when we're awake, it's almost like the blinders on a horse, just keeping you constrained within a certain reality. But when you remove some of those constraints, then people can access skills that they never exhibited, and who knows where those skills come from. I mean, why is it all of a sudden somebody who is neither a mathematician or an artist, all of a sudden, they're losing, brain function, and yet they're developing skills. I mean, what's going on there? Do they have more? Is it possible that that they're accessing that, like you use this terminology of, the idonic versus the demonic, is it that they've got more access to information, to that part of themselves that has lived lives before this, that the part of themselves that is eternal, as opposed to, locked into.
Well, it was one of the things you said about time traveling within these circumstances, where people seem to be able to go back in time and forwards in time. One of the things that happened to my mother when she was declining into Alzheimer's was that I got a phone call from the home one day, and I could hear my mother shouting in the background. She hadn't been communicating. She hadn't spoken to anybody for about 6 months. And there was my old mother's voice coming through with this hysterical old lady. And the home said, "Can you speak to her?" So I spoke directly to her, and she said, "Oh, Tony, I'm glad you phoned me." She said, "Something awful has happened." And I said, "What?" She said, "I was sitting watching Morecambe and Wise on television." Now, they're two English comedians that were very popular in the 1970s. And she said, "And I went for 40 winks, closed my eyes, and I wake up and I'm here. And these people have captured me. I'm going to sue them all. Wait till your father finds out." And I said, "Mum, you're 93 years of age. Look at your hands." And she said, "I don't need to look at my hands." And I realized I was communicating with my mother in her early 50s. And then she turned around, she goes, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Tony." And she said, "No, you sound much older. You're in with these people. You're involved in this." And she slammed the phone down. And when I phoned back, she'd gone back into the semi-catatonic state. But one of the interesting things I discovered was that I did the Babansky test on her feet as she was declining, because she was going into a fetal position. And the Babinski test, there was no Babinski reflex, which is what you would expect if she was kind of reverting back into the womb. And I'm thinking of the Barry Rensburg stuff, Barry Rensburg and retrogenesis, and the idea of going backwards and forwards. And it's as if in these Alzheimer's states, there seems to be a reversal going on, and they're going back into the womb, as it were. And it would be fascinating to be able to test that in some way.
Yeah, it's when I did, I used to love to, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I went into neuropsychiatry. I used to love to sit and talk with the people who had Alzheimer's that would, and oh, Roosevelt's president? Oh, well, it's just fun, to kind of time travel with them and see kind of where they went. And we would do on their neurological exam, I mean, you would test them for what are, called frontal lobe reflexes, because what you start to see is that the same reflexes that I would use when I did my neonatology rotation as a student, where you're doing a neurological on a baby and you're wanting to see, if you tap their forehead, or if you tap them here, or the Babinski that you mentioned, those are all infantile reflexes that then, as your nervous system develops, they go away. But they're there's reflexes that that coordinate this arm with the opposite side's leg, and there are all these reflexes that when the brain starts to the cells start to die off, then you start to see some of these, especially the frontal lobes, you start to see some of these reflexes come back. And it really is like they're going back into that sort of infantile state.
Fascinating, intriguing. Sarah, have you got any final points as we're winding down towards the end of I think the most extraordinary 2 hours I think I've ever been involved in, to be honest. Sarah, have you got any points you'd like to make?
Yeah, just on the point of dreaming, it's interesting about the frontal cortex, because that's the part of the brain that is activated when you start lucid dreaming. And they've been conducting experiments to see if you can make that happen. And I think it's Ursula Voss at Frankfurt who did experiments by, I think it's like a low frequency wave into the frontal cortex that creates a resonance, and then during normal REM that person will spontaneously start lucid dreaming because those kind of frequencies synchronize, which I find really interesting. And then I think, is it also the case that in the case of Alzheimer's, the plaques that develop increase the level of magnetite in the brain, so the magnetite might be picking up on changes within the electromagnetic field of people.
I hadn't heard that, so I'd be interested in seeing that, that the plaques increase the magnetite. Yeah, we have magnetite in the brain, and we have magnetite in the membranes that surround the brain, and then we have magnetite in our skull and in certain sections. And I think that a complete theory, all of these things are different pieces to a complete theory, because and we really need to be looking at frequencies and our ability to detect them. I mean, if you look at we really are just electromagnetic sensors. It's just that each of the senses captures a different band of the frequencies that's out there, and our primary, we're so enamored with our primary sensory organs that are in our head, but the reality is that we have receptors for smell and for color and light perception in our skin.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and it just goes to show how much science culture is influenced by the culture in which it exists as well. Because like you were saying about Russia, I know they've been doing like aura technology and measuring these fields for a long time, because in that culture it's accepted to explore what we would consider esoteric technologies. So I think that especially with discoveries now about people exploring the vagus nerve and this concept of morphogenetic fields, and that we have neurons in our heart and gut, is going to expand our world even in the materialist sense, because previously we've kind of compartmentalized these things rather like more significantly than they are.
Yeah, I think we've really ignored the autonomic nervous system, which is what the vagus nerve is part of. And the autonomic nervous system really plays a huge role in regulating how calm we are. We're living in a society that is the sympathetic nervous system is just so overly activated, and the vagus nerve is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, can help. If we can get that more active, then we can help to calm us down, so that we're not so skewed. And there's something to be said about the autonomic nervous system, because if you think about how states of relaxation are related to our ability to access this information. And you have, on the one hand, you have people who engage in meditative practices that puts them into a state of calm, extreme calmness, but they're very alert and they can access information. But you also have people who have undergone significant emotional trauma, that somehow that emotional trauma cracks open the nut, and they have easier access to information as well. And a lot of those people, because I'm also an expert on trauma, they experience out of body experiences more, especially if the trauma was in childhood, where they disassociate, and they just say, well, it's too painful to be in my body. Too painful to feel my emotions, too painful, or if they have a chronic physical illness, it's very painful, too painful to be in this body. And so their mind-body relationship has a disconnect in it. And as with a lot of these autistic kids, a mind-body disconnect. And so I'm really interested in studying that. And I really think that these technologies that measure energy are the way that we're going to really be able to get some look into that.
Wow. Sorry, Sarah, go on.
I was just going to say about, you were saying that when you first started your research that there were hardly enough autistic children to...
Not a problem now.
Now,
yeah.
There is obviously a lot. So why do you think we suddenly have so many more people presenting as autistic?
Oh boy, you're asking me that in the last 2 minutes of the.
I think we can pick up on that. I think that's an excellent question, but unfortunately we're going to run out of time. We should have thought about that earlier, because I think that was a question that was in my mind as well. In probably in a minute, could you just quickly tell us why you think it is?
Oh, I think it's well, first of all, as I said earlier, that we have microglia in the brain, which are like the macrophages in our immune system in the periphery. And they play a role in modeling the brain, pruning back neurons. Okay, well, they're getting overly activated because the peripheral immune system communicates with those cells in the brain. So the cytokines that are released by the immune system can cross the blood-brain barrier very easily. And the other thing is that a lot of the artificial EMF is toxic to the blood-brain barrier. So we're compromising the blood-brain barrier. Children have far more inflammation, and that's why they have more autoimmune conditions, or they just have more. This is the sickest generation of children yet physically. But then that's also because we aren't just our brain, our whole body is playing a role. It's a whole system. What we're seeing is more inflammation in the brain, and that inflammation in the brain is affecting the actual wiring of the brain.
Wow.
And it happens at these young ages.
Wow, that is extraordinary. This has been an amazing 2 hours. I can't even stress how fascinating I found it. And I'm sure that the people who've been listening in and watching it on Facebook are going to find it fascinating. And the minute we put this up onto YouTube, it's going to get an awful lot of interest. Diane, you've been an absolutely extraordinary guest. Thank you so much for your time. I really have thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody who's been listening in. This has been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to understand your exciting work and what you're doing in the future. So everybody, thank you again for listening in. I know we had some kind of problems initially.